At school, the rich kids mocked the girl for having no toys. But when they saw what the elderly shelter lady brought for her, everyone fell silent. Sarah pressed her nose against the cold window glass, watching the neighbor kids playing with their golden retriever in the small patch of grass between buildings. Her breath left foggy marks on the window as she tracked the tennis ball's path back and forth across the yard. The dog's tail wagged with each catch, and the children's laughter drifted up to her second-floor apartment. She pulled back from the window when her stomach growled. The digital clock on the microwave showed 4:30 p.m. Mom wouldn't be home for another 4 hours. Time for homework, she muttered to herself, the words echoing in the empty apartment. Sarah dragged her backpack to the small kitchen table, which doubled as her desk. She pulled out her math worksheet, but the numbers blurred as she watched a girl across the street walking her cat on a leash. The cat, orange and fluffy, pranced down the sidewalk like it owned the whole block. The radiator in the corner made a loud, clanking sound, startling her. It had been making that noise more often lately, and Mom said they couldn't afford to fix it yet. Sarah pulled her worn sweater tighter around her shoulders and tried to focus on her multiplication tables. The silence in the apartment felt heavy. She could hear every scratch of her pencil, every car passing on the street below, every footstep from the family living upstairs. Sometimes she talked to herself just to hear a voice, but today, even that felt too lonely. I wish, she started, then stopped. Wishing hadn't brought Dad back 3 years ago, and it wouldn't help now. She remembered the day he left, even though she'd been only 5. The sound of the front door closing. Mom crying in the bathroom. The way his side of the closet looked so empty afterward. Now, at 8 years old, those memories felt both distant and too close. At 6 p.m., her stomach wouldn't be ignored anymore. Sarah opened the refrigerator, its light casting a pale glow in the darkening kitchen. Half a gallon of milk, some eggs, bread, and leftover spaghetti from 2 nights ago. She grabbed the container of pasta and put it in the microwave, watching it spin around and around. While she ate at the kitchen table, Sarah did her best to avoid looking at the empty chair across from her. Mom's chair, the chair where Dad used to sit. She pushed the spaghetti around her plate, making little patterns with the sauce. Sarah? Mrs. Johnson's voice came through the thin walls. Everything okay in there, honey? Yes, Mrs. Johnson, Sarah called back to their elderly neighbor. Just doing homework? You know you can come over if you need anything. I know. Thank you. Sarah washed her plate and fork, dried them, and put them away exactly where they belonged. Mom liked everything in its place. It was one less thing for her to worry about when she came home exhausted from her nursing shifts. At 8:15 p.m., Sarah changed into her pajamas and brushed her teeth. She could hear the Martinez family next door having dinner, their muffled laughter and conversations seeping through the walls. Their dog barked occasionally, probably begging for table scraps. She climbed into the twin bed she shared with Mom, pulling the extra blankets up to her chin. The radiator's clanking had gotten louder, and now it barely put out any heat at all. Sarah could see her breath in the air above her face. The sound of keys in the lock made her sit up straight. Mom's familiar footsteps, slower than usual, crossed the living room. Sarah? You still awake? Michelle's voice was tired but warm. Yes, Mom. Michelle appeared in the bedroom doorway, still in her blue hospital scrubs. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair was coming loose from its neat bun. But she smiled when she saw Sarah, and for a moment the apartment didn't feel quite so empty. Did you eat dinner? Michelle asked, sitting on the edge of the bed to take off her shoes. Yes. The spaghetti. Good girl. Did you finish your homework? Sarah nodded, watching as her mother changed into her nightgown. Mom? Jenny next door got a new puppy. Michelle's movement slowed for just a moment. That's nice, honey. And Lisa from my class has 2 cats. Sarah? Michelle's voice held a warning note. I was just saying. Sarah slid down under the covers, turning to face the wall. Michelle got into bed, her body warm against Sarah's back. She wrapped an arm around her daughter and pulled her close. I know it's hard, baby. I'm trying my best. I know, Mom. They lay there in silence, listening to the broken radiator's protests. Sarah felt her mother's breathing even out as she fell asleep, but Sarah stayed awake, counting the headlights that moved across the ceiling. At midnight, She heard her mother crying softly, probably thinking Sarah was asleep. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear the crinkle of paper, bills being opened, numbers being added up. "Please," she heard her mother whisper. "Just let me figure this out." Sarah closed her eyes tight and pretended to be asleep, but her mind kept going back to the black kitten she'd seen in a cardboard box outside the grocery store last week. Someone had written "free" on the box in marker, but Mom had hurried her past without looking. The night grew colder, and Sarah pulled the blankets tighter. In the darkness, she could almost imagine a warm, furry body curled up at her feet, purring softly. Almost. The digital clock blinked 1:23 a.m. when Sarah finally drifted off, her dreams full of wagging tails and gentle purrs, of a home that wasn't quite so quiet. Outside, the city continued its nighttime routine. Cars passed below their window. People walked home from late shifts. Dogs barked in distant apartments. But in the small bedroom of their Brooklyn apartment, Sarah and Michelle slept side by side, their breaths synchronized, while the broken radiator ticked away the hours until morning. The next morning, Sarah's classroom buzzed with excitement. Ms. Thompson stood at the front, writing "field trip" on the whiteboard in big blue letters. Sarah slumped in her seat near the back, trying to ignore the whispers from Jessica and Madison, who sat 2 rows ahead in their matching pink backpacks. "As I mentioned last week," Ms. Thompson said, tapping the board, "tomorrow we're visiting the local animal shelter. Remember to bring your permission slips." Sarah's hand shot up. "Ms. Thompson?" "Yes, Sarah. I have my slip." She pulled the crumpled paper from her backpack. Mom had signed it late last night, her signature messy from exhaustion. Jessica turned around, her blonde ponytail swishing. "We don't need to visit a shelter. Daddy's getting us a purebred Persian cat next week. It costs more than your whole apartment." "Jessica!" Ms. Thompson's voice cracked like a whip. "That's enough." Sarah stared at her worn-out sneakers, the ones with the hole in the left toe. She could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some pitying, others amused. The permission slip felt heavy in her hand. "Everyone line up," Ms. Thompson called. "It's time for lunch." In the cafeteria, Sarah sat alone at her usual table. She unwrapped the peanut butter sandwich Mom had made this morning, the bread slightly squished from being in her backpack. 2 tables over, Jessica and Madison shared their fancy lunchboxes filled with sushi and fresh fruit. "Hey," a quiet voice said. Sarah looked up to see Tommy, a boy from her class who usually sat with the other kids. He held his lunch tray awkwardly. "Can I sit here?" Sarah nodded, surprised. Tommy sat down and opened his milk carton. "Don't listen to Jessica," he said, stabbing at his mac and cheese. "She's just mean because her parents are getting divorced." "Oh." Sarah took a bite of her sandwich. "Thanks." They ate in comfortable silence until the bell rang. As they walked back to class, Tommy said, "I'm excited about tomorrow. My mom volunteers at the shelter sometimes." The next morning arrived with gray clouds and a light drizzle. Sarah put on her only raincoat, a hand-me-down that was slightly too big, and waited at the bus stop. Her stomach felt tight with anticipation. The yellow school bus pulled up at 8:15 a.m., its wipers squeaking against the wet windshield. Sarah climbed aboard, passing rows of chattering students until she found an empty seat near the back. "Can I sit with you?" Tommy appeared again, his glasses slightly fogged from the rain. Sarah scooted over, making room. The bus lurched forward, and Tommy's lunchbox slid across the seat between them. "My mom packed extra cookies," he said, patting the box. "We can share later." The shelter was a 20-minute drive away, in a part of Brooklyn Sarah had never visited. The building was smaller than she'd imagined, with peeling blue paint and a sign that read "Second Chance Animal Shelter" in faded letters. Miss Thompson gathered the class on the sidewalk. "Remember, children, these animals have had difficult lives. We need to be gentle and quiet." Inside, the smell of cleaning supplies mixed with the sounds of barking dogs and meowing cats. A woman in a green shelter vest met them in the lobby. "Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda, and I'll be your guide today." She smiled warmly at the class. "We'll start with the dog section, then move on to the cats." Sarah followed at the back of the group, her heart beating faster with each step. The dog area was loud, with different breeds barking and wagging their tails as the children passed. Jessica and Madison pressed their faces against the chain-link gates, cooing at the puppies. "Look how dirty they are," Jessica whispered to Madison. "My new Persian would never live in a place like this." Sarah ignored them, focusing instead on the eager faces of the dogs. Each kennel had a small card with the dog's name and story. Max, 3 years old, loves tennis balls. Luna, gentle with kids, needs a forever home. After the dogs, Linda led them to the cat room. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Where the dog area had been loud and energetic, the cat room was quiet and dim, with soft classical music playing from a small radio in the corner. "Cats need calm environments," Linda explained. "They get stressed easily." Sarah moved slowly along the row of cages, reading each card carefully. Most of the cats were adults, lounging on beds or watching the children with disinterested eyes. And then she saw him. In the last cage on the bottom row, a tiny black kitten huddled in the corner. He couldn't have been more than a few months old. His fur was sleek but dull, and he trembled slightly as Sarah knelt down. "Hi there," she whispered, putting her finger against the cage. The kitten didn't move, but his eyes, bright green against his dark fur, fixed on her face. Linda appeared beside her. "That's Shadow. He came in last week. Someone found him in a dumpster behind the grocery store." Sarah's throat felt tight. "How old is he?" "About 3 months. He's still pretty scared of people. Won't let anyone hold him yet." Sarah stayed by Shadow's cage while her classmates moved on to the other rooms. She sat cross-legged on the floor, just watching him. After a few minutes, the kitten uncurled slightly and took a tentative step forward. "It's okay," Sarah murmured. "I'm scared sometimes too." Shadow moved closer, his tiny pink nose twitching. When he finally reached the front of the cage, Sarah could see he was even smaller than she'd thought. His ribs showed through his fur. "You're doing better than anyone else has," Linda said, returning with a small bag of treats. "Would you like to try giving him one?" Sarah's hands shook as she took a treat. She held it through the bars, holding her breath. Shadow stretched his neck, sniffed once, and quickly snatched the treat. When he finished eating, he stayed at the front of the cage. "I think he likes you," Linda smiled. "Does anyone want him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Linda's face fell slightly. Black cats are harder to adopt out. People have silly superstitions. Plus, he's so shy. Sarah spent the rest of the visit with Shadow. She talked to him softly about her life, about Mom's long hours, about the broken heater, about eating dinner alone. The kitten watched her with those bright green eyes, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly heard. When Ms. Thompson called for the class to line up, Sarah's eyes burned with tears. "I have to go," she told Shadow. The kitten pressed against the cage bars, letting out a tiny meow, his first sound since she'd arrived. On the bus ride back to school, Tommy shared his cookies as promised, but Sarah could barely taste them. All she could think about was Shadow, alone in his cage, waiting for someone to love him. "You okay?" Tommy asked, offering her the last cookie. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already forming a plan. She had to convince Mom somehow. She had to find a way to bring Shadow home. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. When the final bell rang, Sarah rushed to pack her things. As she headed for the door, Jessica's voice called out, "Hey, Charity Case." Sarah kept walking, her shoulders tight. "I saw you with that ugly black cat. Perfect match. Nobody wants either of you." Sarah ran all the way home, her backpack bouncing against her spine, Jessica's laughter ringing in her ears. But for the first time, the cruel words didn't hurt as much. Because today, in a small cage in a rundown shelter, she'd made a connection. And somehow, some way, she would find a way to make Shadow part of her family. Sarah stood in their tiny kitchen, stirring a pot of mac and cheese. She'd been practicing her speech all afternoon, whispering the words to herself while doing homework. The microwave clock showed 7:45 p.m. Mom would be home soon. The front door's lock clicked, and Sarah's heart jumped. Earlier than usual. "Sarah?" Mom's voice carried a note of exhaustion. "Something smells good. I made dinner." Sarah called back, trying to keep her voice steady. She'd even set the table with their mismatched plates and the paper napkins left over from Christmas. Michelle appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her scrubs. Her eyes widened at the sight of the set table. "What's all this?" I thought you might be hungry. Sarah carefully carried the pot to the table. And I wanted to talk about something. Michelle's expression changed slightly, a small tightening around her eyes. She sat down heavily in her chair, wincing as she took off her shoes. Let me guess. This is about the shelter visit. Sarah froze, mac and cheese spoon halfway to her plate. How did you know? Mrs. Thompson called me during my break. Said you spent the whole time with one particular kitten. Michelle reached for the serving spoon. Baby, you know we can't. His name is Shadow. Sarah interrupted, the words rushing out. He's all black and really small, and nobody wants him because people think black cats are bad luck, but that's stupid, and he's so scared and alone, and he ate treats from my hand, and Linda said he never does that with anyone else, and Sarah. Mom's voice was firm but gentle. Take a breath. Sarah inhaled shakily, her prepared speech forgotten. Mom, please. I'll do anything. I'll clean his litter box every day. I'll get better grades. I'll help more around the house. Stop. Michelle put down her fork. It's not about what you will or won't do. You're already such a good girl. She rubbed her temples. It's about what we can afford. But let me show you something. Michelle stood up and went to her purse, pulling out a stack of envelopes. She spread them across the table, pushing aside their dinner plates. This is the electric bill. This is rent. This is the grocery money. And this. She held up a wrinkled paper with red stamps across it. This is the notice about our heater. Sarah stared at the papers, her mac and cheese getting cold. What about the heater? Michelle sank back into her chair. Mr. Peterson says it needs to be replaced completely. It'll cost $800 we don't have. Her voice cracked slightly. And if we don't fix it soon? What? He's talking about raising our rent. Says he can't have tenants in an apartment with no heat. The kitchen felt suddenly colder, as if the broken heater knew they were talking about it. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. But Mom, Shadow's so tiny. You wouldn't eat much, and I could use my birthday money from Grandma. $20 isn't enough, baby. Michelle's eyes glistened. It's not just food. It's vet bills, litter supplies. And what if he gets sick? We can barely afford our own doctor visits. Sarah pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. It's not fair. No, it's not. Michelle reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. I want to give you everything, Sarah. Everything your friends have. But right now, she gestured at the bills. Right now, we're barely keeping our heads above water. The radiator chose that moment to make a horrible grinding noise, then fell silent. Cold air seeped through the windows. I'll get the extra blankets, Sarah said quietly, standing up. Sarah, it's okay, Mom. I understand. She didn't look back as she went to the closet, pulling out their collection of worn blankets. Some were from Goodwill, others handed down from neighbors. She carried them to their shared bed, piling them high. Michelle followed her into the bedroom. Maybe someday, when things are better. When will that be? Sarah hadn't meant to shout, but the words exploded out of her. After Shadow gets adopted by someone else? After he forgets me? Sarah Elizabeth. Sorry. Sarah climbed onto the bed, burrowing under the blankets. I'm just tired. Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped. I know you are, baby. I am too. She stroked Sarah's hair. I promise I'm trying. I picked up extra weekend shifts at the hospital. If I can just save up enough for the heater. Sarah turned to face the wall, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Can we afford tissues? Because I think we're out. The attempt at humor fell flat. Michelle's hand stilled on Sarah's head. I'll check the budget. Later that night, after Mom had fallen asleep, Sarah crept to the bathroom. She sat on the closed toilet lid, knees pulled up to her chest, and allowed herself to cry properly. The bathroom fan covered the sound of her sobs. She thought about Shadow in his cage, probably curled up in that same corner. Was he cold too? Did the shelter have enough blankets? She remembered how his ribs showed through his fur, how he trembled when she first saw him. It's not fair, she whispered to her reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. Her face was blotchy from crying, her braids coming loose. It's not fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. The bathroom light flickered. Another bill they could barely afford. Sarah quickly wiped her face with toilet paper and tiptoed back to bed. Mom had rolled over in her sleep, one arm stretched across Sarah's side of the mattress. Sarah carefully climbed under the mountain of blankets. Despite the layers, she could still feel the cold seeping through the walls. The digital clock's red numbers seemed to mock her. 11:47 p.m. From the apartment next door, she could hear the Martinez family's dog snoring softly through the thin walls. Down the hall, someone's cat meowed to be let in from the fire escape. Even the building itself seemed full of animal sounds, creaks and groans like a giant beast settling down for the night. But in Sarah and Michelle's apartment, there was only the sound of her mother's breathing and the occasional death rattle of the dying heater. Sarah pulled the blankets over her head, creating a small cave of warmth. In the darkness, she made a silent promise to Shadow. "I'll find a way," she whispered. "Somehow, I promise." The night grew colder, and Sarah pressed closer to her mother's warmth. Outside their window, the city continued its endless rhythm of sirens and car horns. But inside Sarah's mind, there was only the memory of bright green eyes and the soft touch of a tiny pink nose against her finger. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of empty cages and endless stacks of bills, of Shadow growing older and forgetting her, of warm homes with working heaters where other little girls got to hear purring as they fell asleep. The last thing Sarah saw before drifting off was the clock changing to midnight, marking the end of another day without Shadow, another day of the empty silence that filled their apartment like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Sarah woke to the sound of coughing, harsh, deep coughs that shook the whole bed. She rolled over to find Mom curled into a ball, her body trembling under the pile of blankets. "Mom?" Sarah touched her mother's forehead. It burned against her palm. "You're really hot." Michelle tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows. "I'm fine," she rasped. "Just need a minute." Another coughing fit seized her. "You're not fine." Sarah climbed out of bed, shivering in the cold morning air. The heater sat silent in the corner, completely dead now. "I'll call the hospital." "No." Michelle grabbed Sarah's wrist. "Can't miss work. Bills." Her words dissolved into more coughing. Sarah found Mom's phone on the nightstand and scrolled through the contacts until she found hospital, nursing station. Her thumb hovered over the number. "Sarah, please." Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "We need the money. You need a doctor." Sarah pressed the call button. 20 minutes later, she stood in the kitchen making tea with their last tea bag, listening to Mom explain her symptoms to her supervisor. Even through the walls, Sarah could hear the concern in the nurse manager's voice. "Yes, Janet. I know. At least 3 days." Mom's voice cracked. "But my shift tonight." "Yes, understand. Thank you." Sarah carried the tea into the bedroom. Mom sat propped against the headboard, her face flushed with fever. 3 days? Sarah asked. Michelle nodded weakly. "Maybe 4. Janet says there's a bad flu going around the hospital." She accepted the tea with shaking hands. "Sarah, you'll have to stay with Mrs. Johnson while I'm sick. I don't want you catching this. But who's going to take care of you?" "I'll manage." Mom tried to smile, but ended up coughing into her elbow. "Go get ready for school. You're already late." The apartment felt different with Mom sick in bed. Colder. Emptier. Sarah got dressed quickly, putting on 3 layers of clothes. She made herself a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, the last of the bread, and packed her backpack. "I left water and crackers by the bed," she told Mom. "And your phone is charging. Such a good girl." Mom's eyes were already closing. "Love you." "Love you too." Mrs. Johnson was waiting in the hallway when Sarah emerged. The elderly woman's face creased with worry. "I heard the coughing. Your mama's sick?" Sarah nodded. "Can you check on her while I'm at school?" "Of course, honey. Now hurry. I'll write you a late note." School dragged by in a blur of worry. Sarah couldn't focus on her math test, couldn't concentrate during reading time. During lunch, she sat alone again, picking at her sandwich. "Hey." Tommy appeared with his lunch tray. "You okay? You look scared." Sarah shook her head. "Mom's really sick. She can't work for 3 or 4 days." "Oh." Tommy sat quietly for a moment. "My mom got that flu last week. She's better now. But your mom doesn't have to worry about." Sarah stopped herself. Tommy was nice, but she couldn't tell him about their money problems after school. Sarah ran all the way home. She found Mom asleep, the water glass empty, her fever still high. On the kitchen table, a new stack of mail waited. Sarah recognized the red past due stamps on several envelopes. She spent the afternoon trying to clean the apartment, though the lack of heat made her fingers stiff. Around dinner time, Mrs. Johnson brought over a pot of chicken soup. "You eat too, honey," she insisted, ladling out 2 bowls. "Can't take care of your mama if you get sick too." Sarah managed a few spoonfuls, but her stomach felt tight with worry. After Mrs. Johnson left, she checked her piggy bank. $23.45. Not enough for medicine. Not enough for bills. Definitely not enough for a kitten. The thought of Shadow made her throat ache. She hadn't visited the shelter in 3 days. What if someone adopted him? What if they moved him to another shelter? She crept to the bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the steam build up. Mom needed the humidity for her cough. The hot water made the bathroom mirror fog up. Using her finger, Sarah wrote in the condensation, "Please get better." Then smaller, "Please let Shadow wait." That night, she slept on the living room couch, wrapped in their thinnest blanket so Mom could have the others. Every few hours, she woke to check on her mother, refill the water glass, help her to the bathroom. Around midnight, the landlord's heavy footsteps passed their door. Sarah held her breath until they faded away. They were already late on rent. What would happen if they couldn't pay this month? She must have dozed off because suddenly it was 3 a.m. and Mom was calling her name. Sarah found her mother trying to get out of bed, her legs tangled in blankets. "Need medicine," Mom gasped between coughs. "Tylenol." Sarah checked the bathroom cabinet. Empty. The kitchen cabinet. Also empty. Her hands started to shake. "Mom, we're out." Michelle fell back against the pillows, her breathing labored. "Top drawer, my dresser. Emergency card." Sarah found the credit card hidden under a stack of old photos. She knew what it meant. More debt, more bills, more stress. But Mom's fever was getting worse. "Mrs. Johnson." She banged on the neighbor's door. "Please wake up." The elderly woman answered quickly, already dressed. "I heard the coughing." CVS. 10 minutes later, they hurried through the dark streets to the 24-hour pharmacy. Sarah clutched the credit card like a lifeline. The fluorescent lights inside the store made her eyes hurt. $42, she whispered, staring at the total for Tylenol, cough medicine, and a humidifier. Mrs. Johnson squeezed her shoulder. "Your mama needs it, honey." Back home, Sarah measured out doses carefully, helping Mom sit up to swallow the pills. The new humidifier hummed in the corner, pushing moisture into the dry air. "I'm sorry," Mom murmured as she drifted off to sleep. "So sorry." Sarah sat on the floor beside the bed, leaning against the wall. The sun would be up soon. Another day of worry, of counting pennies, of trying to keep their small world from falling apart. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. "Asked my mom about the shelter. Shadow's still there. No one's adopted him yet." Sarah pressed the phone to her chest, tears sliding down her face. In the dark room, with Mom's ragged breathing as background noise, she made a decision. She couldn't fix everything. Couldn't make Mom better instantly. Couldn't repair the heater or pay all the bills. But maybe, just maybe, she could save one small black kitten from being alone, even if it meant doing something desperate. The rest of the night passed in a haze of cough, medicine doses, and temperature checks. When dawn finally arrived, painting the walls with weak winter light, Sarah was still awake, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She had promised Shadow she would find a way, and Sarah Elizabeth Williams did not break her promises, no matter what it took. The clock showed 9:45 p.m. when Sarah made her move. Mom had finally fallen into a deep sleep, her breathing easier thanks to the medicine and humidifier. Sarah stood in the bedroom doorway, watching her mother's chest rise and fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling on her warmest sweater. Over went her coat, the one with the broken zipper. She stuffed her $23.45 into her pocket. The floor creaked as she crept to the front door. Sarah froze, heart pounding, but Mom didn't stir. Mrs. Johnson's TV murmured through the wall, her nightly news program. No one would check on them until morning. Sarah's hand trembled as she turned the deadbolt. The click seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. She slipped into the hallway, carefully pulling the door shut behind her. The building stairwell smelled like cigarettes and old takeout. Sarah's sneakers made soft squeaking sounds on the steps. At the bottom, she peeked through the lobby window. The street looked different at night. Darker, emptier, scarier. Shadow needs me, she told herself, pushing open the heavy front door. Cold air hit her face like a slap. Sarah had memorized the route to the shelter during their field trip. 20 minutes by bus, Linda had said. But the buses wouldn't be running this late. She'd have to walk. The streetlights cast orange pools on the sidewalk. Sarah stuck to these bright spots, avoiding the darker shadows between them. Her breath made little clouds in the cold air. A group of teenagers passed on the other side of the street, laughing loudly. Sarah pressed herself against a building until they were gone. Mom would be terrified if she knew where Sarah was right now. 6 blocks down, turn right at the big church, she muttered, reciting the directions in her head. Then 4 blocks to the main road. The big church loomed ahead, its stained glass windows dark. Sarah hurried past, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. A car drove by, its headlights sweeping across her. She ducked into a doorway until it passed. The main road was busier. More cars, more people heading home from late shifts. Sarah kept her head down, trying to look like she belonged. Like she wasn't an 8-year-old girl wandering alone at night. "Hey, kid." A man's voice made her jump. "You lost?" Sarah looked up to see a hot dog vendor packing up his cart. His face was weathered but kind. "I'm okay," she said quickly, walking faster. "It's late for a little girl to be out alone," he called after her. "Want me to call someone?" Sarah broke into a run, her legs burning with cold. Behind her, she heard the vendor mutter something about calling the police. She ran faster. The streets started looking unfamiliar. The buildings grew shorter, dingier. This didn't look like the route they'd taken on the field trip. Sarah stopped under a streetlight, trying to get her bearings. A woman in scrubs like Mom's approached, carrying a grocery bag. "Are you all right, sweetie?" Sarah almost started crying at the familiar uniform. "I'm trying to get to Second Chance Animal Shelter. I think I'm lost." The woman frowned. "That's in the opposite direction, and it's closed at this hour." She shifted her grocery bag. "Where are your parents?" "My mom's." Sarah's voice caught. "She's waiting for me." "No, she's not." The woman set down her bag and pulled out her phone. "Let me call you a cab? Or the police?" "No." Sarah backed away. "Please, I just need directions." The woman's face softened. "The shelter's that way." She pointed back the way Sarah had come. "About 8 blocks. But honey, it's after 10. No one will be there." "Thank you." Sarah was already running again, ignoring the woman's calls to come back. 8 blocks. Her legs felt like lead, and her lungs burned from the cold air. But she thought of Shadow, alone in his cage, maybe wondering if she'd forgotten him. She couldn't give up. The neighborhood changed again, more familiar now. She passed the coffee shop where the bus had turned left, the laundromat with the broken sign. Almost there, and then she saw it, the blue building with the faded sign. Sarah's heart leaped, and then plunged. The windows were dark, the parking lot empty. A heavy padlock secured the front door. "No, no, no." She ran to the door, pulling uselessly at the handle. Through the glass, she could see the empty lobby. No Linda, no cats, no Shadow. Sarah pressed her face against the cold window, trying to see into the cat room. But it was too dark, too far away. Somewhere in there, Shadow was sleeping in his cage. Did he think she'd abandoned him? A noise behind her made Sarah spin around. A security guard emerged from around the corner, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hey, what are you doing there?" Sarah's legs wouldn't move. The flashlight blinded her. "Jesus Christ," the guard muttered, lowering the light. "You're just a kid. What the hell are you doing here?" The tears finally came, hot and fast. I wanted... She couldn't get the words out. The guard, his name tag read Mike, approached slowly, like she was a scared animal. Okay. Take it easy." He crouched down to her level. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Sarah told him everything. About Shadow. About Mom being sick. about the broken heater and the bills and the desperate plan to somehow save the little black kitten who'd trusted her. Mike listened quietly, his weathered face serious. When she finished, he pulled out his phone. "Gotta call this in, kid. Your mom's probably worried sick." "Please," Sarah whispered. "Can I just see him? Just for a minute?" Mike's face softened. "Shadow, right? The shy black kitten?" At Sarah's nod, he sighed. "I check on him every night during my rounds. He's doing okay. Still waiting for the right family. He trusted me." Sarah's voice cracked. "I promised I'd help him. And you will." Mike dialed his phone. "But right now, we need to get you home safe. Then maybe you and your mom can come back during regular hours. Do things the right way." Sarah heard him talking to the police, giving their location. She slid down to sit on the shelter's front step, exhaustion hitting her all at once. The night air grew colder. Mike draped his security jacket over her shoulders. "Police will be here soon. They'll take you home." Sarah looked up at the shelter's dark windows. Somewhere inside, Shadow slept in his cage, unaware of how far she'd come trying to reach him, unaware of how far she still had to go. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. Red and blue lights painted the shelter walls. Sarah pulled Mike's jacket tighter around her, thinking of Mom waking up to find her gone, of the worry and fear she must be feeling. "I'm sorry, Shadow," she whispered as the police car pulled up. "I tried." The female officer who stepped out looked like she could be someone's mom. Her partner stayed in the car, radioing their location. "Sarah Williams?" the officer asked gently. At Sarah's nod, she continued, "Your mother's been worried sick. Let's get you home." As they helped her into the back of the patrol car, Sarah looked one last time at the shelter. The windows stared back, dark and empty, holding their secrets until morning. The ride home was quiet. Sarah watched the familiar streets pass, retracing in minutes the journey that had taken her hours on foot. The officer in the passenger seat kept glancing back at her in the rearview mirror, but didn't ask questions. They pulled up to her building just as Mrs. Johnson burst out the front door, followed by Mom in her robe and slippers, barely able to stand. "Baby!" Mom's voice was still raspy from coughing. "Oh God, Sarah!" Sarah ran from the police car into her mother's arms, both of them crying now. Mom's skin still felt too warm with fever. "I'm sorry," Sarah sobbed in her mother's robe. "I'm so sorry." Above them, the night sky stretched vast and cold, studded with stars barely visible through the city lights. Somewhere in a dark shelter, a little black kitten slept on, unaware of the desperate journey made in his name, or the even longer journey still to come. The next morning, Sarah sat in the shelter's office, her legs dangling from a chair that was too big for her. Mom sat next to her, still looking pale and tired, but the fever had finally broken. Neither of them had slept much after the police brought Sarah home. Linda stood by the desk, talking quietly with an elderly woman Sarah hadn't seen before. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a volunteer badge that read Dorothy. "Sarah," Linda said finally, turning to face them. "Mike told us what happened last night. About why you came here." Sarah stared at her shoes. The left one still had that hole in it. "Look at me, sweetheart." Dorothy's voice was gentle but firm. She pulled up a chair to sit directly in front of Sarah. "No one's angry. We just want to understand." Mom squeezed Sarah's hand. "It's okay, baby. Tell them." Sarah took a shaky breath. "I had to see Shadow. I was afraid." Her voice caught. "Afraid someone would adopt him before I could save enough money." "Save enough money?" Dorothy leaned forward slightly. The words started spilling out like water from a broken dam. "I've been collecting bottles for the deposit. And Mrs. Johnson said I could help her with her groceries for $2 each time. And Tommy at school offered to share his lunch, so I could save my lunch money. But it's not enough. It's never enough." Mom made a small sound, like she'd been hurt. And then Sarah wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Then Mom got sick, and we had to use the emergency credit card for medicine, and the heater's still broken, and Mr. Peterson wants to raise our rent, and—" "Breathe, honey," Dorothy said softly. "Take your time." Sarah looked up at the elderly woman's face. There was something in her eyes. Not pity, but understanding. "Shadow trusts me," Sarah whispered. "He ate treats from my hand. Linda said he never does that with anyone else." And he's all alone, like... She glanced at her mother. Like us? Dorothy nodded slowly. Tell me about your day, Sarah. What's it like when you get home from school? Sarah described the empty apartment, the cold rooms, the silent meals. She talked about watching other kids play with their pets, about the loneliness that felt like a physical weight. Sometimes, she admitted, I talk to myself just to hear a voice. Is that weird? No, sweetheart. Dorothy's eyes were bright with tears. That's not weird at all. Linda handed Sarah a tissue. Mom hadn't said a word, but her grip on Sarah's hand had gotten tighter. You know, Dorothy said, adjusting her volunteer badge, I was a single mother once. Long time ago, back in the 80s. My Emily was about your age. Sarah wiped her nose. Really? We lived in a tiny apartment, not much bigger than a closet. I worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night. Emily spent a lot of time alone. Like me? Dorothy nodded. Just like you. And one day, she found this scraggly orange cat in the alley behind our building. Skinny little thing, missing half an ear. Did you let her keep it? Sarah held her breath. I said no at first. Same reasons your mother gave you. No money, too many bills, too much responsibility. Dorothy's voice grew softer. But Emily, she did exactly what you did. Tried to save money, made all sorts of promises. And one night, I found her crying in our bathroom, talking to herself about how unfair everything was. Mom made that small hurt sound again. What happened? Sarah whispered. Well, as it turns out, sometimes life sends us angels when we need them most. In our case, it was the building superintendent. He'd been feeding that orange cat for weeks. When he heard about our situation, he offered to help with the cat food and litter. Said he had plenty left over from his own cats. Dorothy leaned back in her chair. That cat lived with us for 15 years. Changed our lives completely. Emily had someone to come home to, someone to talk to. She started smiling more, doing better in school. And she smiled at the memory. I learned that sometimes the best decisions aren't the most practical ones. Linda cleared her throat. Dorothy, should we tell them? The elderly woman reached into her large purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Sarah, do you know what a sponsorship program is? Sarah shook her head. It's when someone helps pay for an animal's care. Food, supplies, vet visits, everything they need to be healthy and happy. Sarah's heart started beating faster. I've been volunteering here for 30 years, Dorothy continued. Never married again after Emily's father left. When my Emily grew up and had her own family, I decided to set up a fund. For special cases. She opened the envelope. For children like you, Sarah. Children who have so much love to give, but need a little help getting started. Mom's hand trembled in Sarah's. Ms. Dorothy, we couldn't possibly. Michelle? Dorothy's voice was kind but firm. Let me tell you what I see. I see a little girl who walked across Brooklyn in the middle of the night, not to steal or cause trouble, but because she made a promise to a scared kitten. I see a mother working herself sick to keep a roof over her daughter's head. And I see so much love in this room, it nearly breaks my heart. She pulled out some papers from the envelope. The sponsorship covers 1 year of basic care, food, litter, routine vet visits. After that, if you're in a better position, you can take over. If not, we'll figure something out. Because that's what family does. Family? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, honey. Everyone who comes through these shelter doors becomes part of our family. Even the ones who have to leave in the middle of the night with security guards calling the police. Sarah felt her face get hot, but Dorothy winked at her. But Mom's voice was hoarse. The apartment deposit, pet rent, already taken care of. Linda stepped forward. Mike, our security guard, he talked to Mr. Peterson this morning. Apparently, they play poker together every Thursday. Mr. Peterson agreed to waive the pet deposit in exchange for Mike fixing your heater at cost. Something about owing him from their last game. Sarah could hardly breathe. She looked at her mother, hardly daring to hope. Mom was crying now, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Dorothy said simply. Say yes, and let's go get that kitten before he thinks Sarah's forgotten him again. Please, Mom, Sarah whispered. Please. Michelle looked at her daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like forever. She saw the hope in Sarah's eyes, the love she had to give, the responsibility she was ready to take on. "Yes," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Yes." Sarah threw her arms around her mother's neck, both of them crying now. Dorothy and Linda exchanged knowing looks. Well then, Dorothy stood up, her joints creaking slightly. "Let's go see a certain black kitten who's been waiting far too long for his forever home." As they walked to the cat room, Sarah felt like she was floating. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the shelter walls more welcoming. Even the antiseptic smell couldn't dampen her joy. At Shadow's cage, Sarah knelt down just like before. The kitten was in his usual corner, but when he saw her, his ears perked up. He remembered. "Hi, Shadow," she whispered, putting her finger against the cage. "I came back, just like I promised." And there, in front of everyone, the tiny black kitten got up and walked straight to her finger. His pink nose touched it once, twice, and then he began to purr. It was a small sound, barely audible over the shelter's ambient noise. But to Sarah, it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. It was the sound of a promise kept, of love given and received, of a silence finally being filled. The adoption papers lay spread across the shelter's front desk. Mom's hands shook slightly as she filled them out, her handwriting careful and precise. Sarah stood on tiptoes, watching each line being completed, hardly daring to breathe. "Date of birth?" Mom asked, pen hovering over the form. Linda checked Shadow's file. "The vet estimates around October 15th. He's just about 3.5 months old." "He's a baby," Sarah whispered. Shadow sat in his carrier next to her, still nervous but not trembling anymore. She could hear his soft breathing through the metal grate. Dorothy appeared from the back room, carrying a large cardboard box. "Every new family gets a starter kit," she explained, setting it on the floor. "Litter box, food bowls, toys, a bed." Sarah peeked inside the box. A small blue collar lay on top, with a tiny bell attached. "Can I see it?" Dorothy handed her the collar. The bell made a gentle tinkling sound that made Shadow's ears twitch. "Now," Dorothy pulled up a chair, her knees creaking. "Let's talk about the sponsorship details." She produced more papers from her endless supply of manila envelopes. "Everything's paid up for 1 year. Food, litter, regular checkups at Dr. Martinez's clinic down the street." Mom stopped writing. "Dr. Martinez? But that's a private practice. It must be expensive." "He's an old friend," Dorothy smiled. "Does pro bono work for our sponsor pets. Has a soft spot for cases like yours." She patted the carrier gently. "Shadow here will get the best care in Brooklyn." Linda returned with a folder labeled New Pet Parent Guide. "This is everything you need to know. Feeding schedules, litter box training, emergency numbers. And my personal cell is on the front. Call anytime, day or night." Sarah clutched the blue collar to her chest. It felt too good to be true. Any moment, she might wake up in their cold apartment. Everything just another dream. "Oh!" Dorothy exclaimed suddenly. Almost forgot the most important part. She reached in her large purse and pulled out an envelope. "Mike asked me to give you this." Mom opened the envelope. A handwritten note fell out along with what looked like a business card. "He says he'll be by tomorrow morning to look at your heater," Dorothy explained. "That's his work invoice. Parts at cost, labor-free. Something about Mr. Peterson and a royal flush." Mom's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't understand. Why is everyone being so kind?" Dorothy's face grew serious. "Michelle, look at me." She waited until Mom met her eyes. 30 years ago, I was you, working myself to exhaustion, trying to give my Emily everything she needed. Too proud to ask for help, too scared to let anyone in." She reached over and took Mom's hand. "Someone helped us back then. Changed our whole lives with one act of kindness. This is me paying it forward." A small meow came from the carrier, Shadow's first sound since they put him in there. Sarah knelt down to peer through the grate. "It's okay. We're going home soon." "Yes, you are." Linda began gathering the completed forms. "Just need your signature here, Michelle. And Sarah, you can sign as a witness right here." Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote her name in careful letters. It looked small next to Mom's signature, but just as important. "Now then," Dorothy stood up, her joints popping. Let's get this boy home. The walk to the bus stop felt like a dream. Sarah carried the box of supplies while Mom held the carrier. Shadow stayed quiet, occasionally shifting position when they hit a bump in the sidewalk. On the bus, an elderly man offered them his seat when he saw the carrier. New family member? He asked kindly. Yes, Sarah answered, unable to keep the pride from her voice. His name is Shadow. At their building, Mr. Peterson was waiting in the lobby. His usual stern expression softened when he saw them. Mike called, he said gruffly. He'll be here at 8 tomorrow. Make sure you're home. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mom's voice was steady despite her obvious exhaustion. He hesitated. Take good care of that cat. My late wife, she loved black cats. Said they were good luck, no matter what anyone else thought. Sarah hugged the supply box tighter. We will. Promise. Their apartment felt different somehow. Warmer, despite the broken heater. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that it wouldn't be empty anymore. Where should we put his stuff? Sarah asked, already planning the perfect spot for everything. Mom surveyed their small living room. How about by the window? He can watch the birds while we're gone. They set up the litter box in the bathroom corner, the food and water bowls in the kitchen. The bed, a soft, round cushion with high sides, went under the window as planned. Finally, it was time. Mom placed the carrier on the floor and opened the door. Let him come out on his own. She remembered Linda's instructions. Don't force it. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, the blue collar in her lap. She could see Shadow's green eyes glowing in the carrier's darkness. It's okay, she whispered. This is your home now. No more cages. Slowly, so slowly, Shadow crept to the carrier's entrance. His nose appeared first, testing the air. Then one paw. Another. His whiskers twitched as he took in the new smells. When he finally emerged completely, Sarah held her breath. He was even more beautiful in their apartment than he'd been at the shelter. His black fur caught the afternoon light, revealing hints of brown and silver. Shadow took a tentative step toward Sarah, then another. When he reached her knee, he stretched up slightly, sniffing her hand. Can I put your collar on? She asked softly. Linda showed me how. The kitten held still as she fastened the blue collar around his neck. The bell made a tiny sound, and Shadow jumped slightly, then relaxed. Mom sat down next to them, moving slowly to avoid startling their new family member. He's already so different from the shelter. Look how brave he's being. Shadow turned at the sound of her voice. He studied Mom for a long moment, then did something that made Sarah's heart skip. He walked over and rubbed against her leg. Oh! Mom's voice caught. She reached down tentatively and stroked his back. Shadow arched into her touch, and a low purr filled the room. Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she watched her mother and their new kitten bonding. The sound of Shadow's purring seemed to fill every corner of their apartment, chasing away the silence that had lived there for so long. Thank you, she whispered, not sure who she was thanking, Dorothy, Linda, Mike, Mr. Peterson, or maybe all of them, maybe even Shadow himself, for choosing them just as much as they'd chosen him. Mom wiped her own eyes. Hungry, baby? We should eat before it gets too late. Can we eat on the floor? So Shadow doesn't feel alone. They made sandwiches and sat on the living room carpet, watching as Shadow explored his new territory. He moved cautiously, but with growing confidence, investigating every corner, every shadow. When he finally got tired, he did something that made both Sarah and Mom gasp. He walked straight to Sarah, climbed into her lap, and curled up into a tight black ball. The purring resumed, louder now. Sarah sat perfectly still, afraid to move and break the spell. Mom, she whispered. Yes, baby. Is this real? He's really ours? Mom reached over and squeezed her hand. Really and truly. Forever. Outside, the city continued its endless symphony of sounds. But inside apartment 2B, a new sound had joined the melody. The gentle purring of a tiny black kitten who had found his way home. The next morning, Sarah woke to something tickling her nose. She opened her eyes to find Shadow perched on her pillow, his tail brushing her face. The little bell on his collar jingled as he moved. Good morning to you too, she whispered, trying not to wake Mom. Shadow responded with a tiny MRRP sound that made Sarah's heart melt. One day in, and he was already finding his voice. The apartment felt different, warmer somehow. Mike had arrived at 8 sharp, toolbox in hand, and spent 2 hours fixing the heater. Now it hummed steadily, pushing warm air through the rooms. What should we put here? Sarah asked Shadow, clearing a space on the windowsill. The kitten watched intently as she arranged his toys. A small mouse, a crinkly ball, a feather on a string. Mom stirred in bed. Sarah, what time is it? Almost 9. Mike fixed the heater already. 9. Mom sat up quickly. I'm late for her. She stopped, remembering. Dr. Janet had insisted she take the whole week off to recover from the flu. Oh, right. Shadow hopped down from the windowsill and trotted over to the bed, his bell announcing his approach. He looked up at Mom, then at the space beside her, then back at her. I think he wants up, Sarah said. Mom patted the blanket. Come on then, little one. They watched in amazement as Shadow gathered himself and leaped, landing gracefully on the bed. He walked straight to Mom and headbutted her hand. Well, good morning to you too, Mom laughed, scratching behind his ears. The sound of her laughter, real, genuine laughter, filled the room like sunshine. The morning developed a rhythm they'd never had before. Sarah filled Shadow's food bowl while Mom made breakfast. The kitten alternated between eating and running to check what each of them was doing, his bell creating a soundtrack to their movements. He's like a tiny supervisor, Mom observed as Shadow inspected her toast-making technique. Linda said cats like routines, Sarah remembered from the adoption guide. It makes them feel safe. Around 10, Mrs. Johnson knocked on their door. Just checking if you need anything from the store? Oh. She stopped at the sight of Shadow, who had taken up position on the back of their worn couch. Who's this handsome fellow? Sarah proudly made the introductions. This is Shadow. Shadow, this is Mrs. Johnson. The kittens studied their elderly neighbor with interest. Mrs. Johnson moved slowly into the apartment, letting him adjust to her presence. My Herbert and I had cats for 40 years, she said, carefully extending her hand for Shadow to sniff. Best company in the world. Shadow seemed to consider this, then leaned forward to rub his head against her fingers. Oh my, Mrs. Johnson's eyes glistened. He's a special one, isn't he? And look at this nice, warm apartment. Mike did a good job. The whole building's been so kind, Mom said softly. I don't know how to thank everyone. Nonsense. Mrs. Johnson waved away her words. That's what neighbors are for. Now, who wants to help me make a pot of chicken soup? That kitten looks like he could use some meat on his bones. They spent the afternoon in Mrs. Johnson's kitchen, the smell of soup filling the air. Shadow explored every corner of the apartment, growing bolder with each discovery. His bell kept them informed of his location. Under the table, behind the curtains, investigating the mysterious space behind the TV. The Martinez family wants to meet him later, Mrs. Johnson mentioned as she chopped carrots. Their dog is good with cats, they said, and little Jenny from 3C asked if she could come play with him sometime. Sarah looked up from her potato peeling duty. Really? Jenny never talks to me at school. Pets have a way of bringing people together, Mrs. Johnson smiled. You'll see. Back in their apartment, Shadow demonstrated his growing confidence by scaling the couch, then using it as a launching pad to reach the windowsill. He settled there like a king on his throne, watching the street below. Look, Mom, Sarah pointed. He's not scared anymore. Mom wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Neither are you, baby. Sarah thought about that. It was true. The apartment didn't feel lonely anymore. Even when Shadow was sleeping, which he did a lot, the simple knowledge of his presence changed everything. The afternoon brought more visitors. The Martinez family came by with a gift, a cat tower they'd found at a yard sale. Their dog, Max, sat politely in the hallway while Shadow investigated him through the crack under the door. They'll be friends soon, mister, Martinez assured them. Max loves cats. Too much sometimes. Jenny from 3C appeared with her mother, clutching a bag of cat treats. Can I give him one? She asked shyly. Sarah nodded, showing her how to hold her hand flat. Shadow approached cautiously, but took the treat, then surprised everyone by staying for pets. He's so soft. Ginny whispered. Like velvet. Want to come over tomorrow after school? Sarah found herself asking. He really likes the feather toy. Ginny's face lit up. Can I, Mom? By evening, their small apartment had seen more visitors than in the past year combined. Shadow handled each one with growing confidence, as if he'd appointed himself the official greeter. Tired, little man? Mom asked as Shadow yawned widely, showing tiny white teeth. Big day for all of us? They had soup for dinner, Mrs. Johnson's chicken soup, delivered in a large pot to build up your strength. Shadow sat between their chairs, looking up hopefully until Mom put a small piece of chicken in his bowl. Just this once, she said firmly, but Sarah saw her sneaking him another piece later. Bedtime brought a new challenge. Where would Shadow sleep? They'd set up his bed by the window, but as Sarah and Mom got ready for bed, the kitten had other ideas. He followed them into the bathroom as they brushed their teeth, sat on the hamper while they changed into pajamas, and when they finally got into bed, he stood by their pillows with an expectant expression. I guess he's made his choice. Mom laughed as Shadow settled between their heads, purring loudly. Sarah reached up to stroke his soft fur. Is this okay? Him sleeping with us? More than okay. Mom's voice was thick with emotion. This is perfect. They lay there in the warm darkness, listening to Shadow's purring mix with the steady hum of the working heater. Sarah thought about how much had changed in just one day. The warm apartment, the friendly neighbors Ginny wanted to play after school. Mom, thank you for saying yes. Mom found her hand under the blankets and squeezed it. Thank you for showing me what we were missing. Shadow's purring grew louder, as if in agreement. His little body radiated warmth between them, a tiny furnace of love and contentment. Sarah felt sleep approaching, but for the first time in years, she didn't dread it. Tomorrow would bring more adventures, more discoveries, more moments of joy as they all adjusted to their new life together. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the gentle tinkling of Shadow's bell as he shifted position, followed by Mom's soft goodnight and the kitten's answering chirp. Their apartment wasn't silent anymore. It was filled with the sounds of family, breathing, purring, the occasional jingle of a tiny bell. The sounds of home. 1 month had passed since Shadow came home. Sarah stood at the front of her classroom, holding a paper that trembled slightly in her hands. It was Share Your Story Day in Ms. Thompson's class, and for once, Sarah hadn't tried to sit in the back. My story is called The Promise, she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It's about a little black kitten named Shadow, and how he changed everything. Jessica and Madison sat in their usual spots, but they weren't whispering or giggling today. Their eyes were fixed on Sarah, especially when she described her nighttime journey to the shelter. I thought I was trying to save Shadow, Sarah read from her paper. But really, he was saving us. He showed us that we weren't alone, that there were people who wanted to help if we just let them. Tommy gave her a thumbs up from his seat. Next to him, Ginny nodded encouragingly. They'd become regular visitors to apartment 2B, spending afternoons playing with Shadow and doing homework while the kitten supervised from his cat tower. When Sarah finished reading, the class was silent for a moment. Then Ms. Thompson wiped her eyes and started clapping. The other students joined in, even Jessica. That was beautiful, Sarah, Ms. Thompson said. Would you like to put it on our best stories wall? Sarah nodded, clutching her paper. She'd worked hard on it, staying up late with Shadow curled in her lap as she wrote draft after draft. Mom had helped with spelling, but the words were all Sarah's. As she pinned her story to the wall, Jessica approached hesitantly. Is it true? About the security guard and the old lady helping you? Dorothy, Sarah corrected. She visits every week now. Brings treats for Shadow. Could I? Jessica twisted her designer bracelet nervously. Could I maybe come see him sometime? Sarah thought about how Shadow had brought out the best in everyone he met, Mrs. Johnson's motherly warmth, Mr. Peterson's hidden kindness, even Mike's gruff generosity. Maybe he could work his magic on Jessica, too. Sure, she said. He likes meeting new people. At lunch, Sarah sat with Tommy and Jenny, but other kids started joining their table, too. They all wanted to hear more about Shadow, about his latest adventures and silly habits. He sleeps in the weirdest positions, Sarah told them, showing pictures on the phone Mom had given her for emergencies. Shadow sprawled on his back, paws in the air, Shadow wedged into the bathroom sink. Shadow somehow folded into a perfect circle on top of the microwave. "He's really beautiful," Madison said, looking over Jessica's shoulder at the photos. "My Persian just looks grumpy all the time." The afternoon brought more changes. Dr. Janet had called Mom in her office at the hospital. Sarah waited at Mrs. Johnson's apartment, helping to bake cookies while Shadow and Max the dog watched through the doorway. Now friends who touched noses and greeting. When Mom came home, her eyes were bright with excitement. "They're promoting me," she announced as soon as she walked in. "Head nurse for the pediatric unit. Better hours, better pay." Mrs. Johnson hugged her while Sarah danced around them. Shadow, startled by the commotion, retreated to his tower, but watched with interest. "We'll have to celebrate," Mrs. Johnson declared. "I'll make my special lasagna. Dorothy should come too." None of this would have happened without her. That evening, their small apartment was full of people and food and laughter. Dorothy brought an enormous cat bed, his 3-month adoption anniversary present, which Shadow immediately claimed. Mike stopped by after his shift, accepting cookies and compliments about the heater that still worked perfectly. Mr. Peterson arrived with his wife's old cat toys, a box he'd kept in his basement for years. "Time they were used again," he said gruffly, watching Shadow attack a catnip mouse with fierce determination. Jenny and her parents came down from 3C. The Martinez family brought tamales. Tommy and his mom arrived with a hand-drawn card signed by the whole class, even Jessica and Madison. Shadow moved through the crowd like a tiny host, accepting pets and treats, playing with his new toys, showing off his climbing skills on the cat tower. The bell on his collar, still the original blue one from his first day, created a cheerful soundtrack to the celebration. "Look at him now," Dorothy said softly to Sarah. "Remember how scared he was in the shelter? All he needed was a chance to shine." Sarah watched as Shadow headbutt Mom's leg, asking to be picked up. In the past month, both of them had changed so much. Mom smiled more, laughed more. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. "And Sarah, I got an A on my math test," she told Dorothy. "And Jenny invited me to her birthday party next week. You're shining too, honey." Dorothy hugged her close. "You both are?" Later, after the guests had gone home and the leftovers were packed away, Sarah sat at the kitchen table writing in her new journal, a gift from Miss Thompson. Shadow sprawled across her homework, purring as she scratched behind his ears. "Dear future Sarah," she wrote. "Today I learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest things. Like a little black kitten who nobody wanted." Mom came to read over her shoulder, still in her scrubs from work, but standing straighter, prouder. "That's beautiful, baby. Want to read me more?" They sat together, shadows stretched across both their laps, as Sarah read about their journey. About cold nights and empty rooms, about promises kept and kindness found in unexpected places. About a community that had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. And now, she read, our apartment isn't quiet anymore. It's full of purring and bell jingling and people visiting. Full of love. Mom wiped her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "Shadow taught me," Sarah said simply. "He showed me that being brave doesn't mean doing everything alone." As if hearing his name, Shadow rolled over and chirped, his special sound that was just for them. His green eyes, once so frightened in that shelter cage, now shone with confidence and trust. "You know what else?" Sarah continued writing. "Today, Jessica asked to come visit Shadow. A month ago, I wouldn't have believed it. But now I know that people can surprise you. They can change. They can learn to be kind." The apartment had changed too. Photos covered the walls. Shadow's first day home. Sarah and Jenny doing homework while he helped. Mom napping with him on her chest. The cat tower stood proud by the window, toys scattered around its base. Everything was a little messy, a little more lived in, a lot more loved. "One more thing," Sarah wrote as Shadow purred louder. "Dear future Sarah, never forget what it felt like to make a promise and keep it. Never forget that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. And never forget that home isn't just a place. It's the people and cats who fill it with love." Mom read the last lines and pulled Sarah close. Shadow adjusted to accommodate the hug, somehow managing to purr even louder. Outside, the city continued its endless dance of lights and sounds. But inside apartment 2B, a family, two humans and one small black cat, had found their perfect rhythm together. Sarah closed her journal and looked at Shadow, remembering that first moment at the shelter when he'd trusted her enough to eat from her hand. "We did it," she whispered to him. "We all did it?" Shadow blinked slowly at her. "A cat kiss," Dorothy had explained. Then he stretched, jumped down, and trotted to their bedroom, bell jingling. At the doorway, he turned and waited, clearly expecting them to follow. "Coming, Your Majesty," Mom laughed. As they got ready for bed, Sarah thought about tomorrow, about Jenny coming over after school, about Mom's new job starting next week, about Dorothy's promised visit on Saturday. So many good things to look forward to. Shadow took his usual place between their pillows, purring his nighttime song. Mom kissed Sarah's forehead, then reached up to scratch Shadow's ears. "Good night, my loves," she whispered. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Shadow." The little black cat chirped once more, then settled into sleep, his purrs gentling to a soft rumble. Sarah closed her eyes, warm and safe and perfectly happy. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. But now they would write it together, one purr, one smile, one act of kindness at a time. And it would be beautiful.